Hello. You see that our participants are coming on here. Welcome to today's webinar on meeting the behavioral health needs of sexual minorities, part 2. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, housed at Rutgers, the School of Health Professions, Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation, and Counseling Professions. My name is Ann Murphy, and I am the co-director of the MHTTC, and will be facilitating the webinar today. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. Please visit the MHTTC website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. Before we begin the webinar, I wanted to quickly review some housekeeping items. Today's webinar is part 2 of a 2-part series. In order to receive a certificate of completion for your participation, you'll need to attend both webinars. We also wanted to ask that you complete the survey that you'll receive via email following today's webinar. We value your feedback and we use it to improve our activities and to inform our future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these services. To the completion of these surveys. So they're very important both in terms of feedback and in terms of letting SAMHSA know that we have participants attending and appreciating the work that we're providing. So we thank you in advance for that feedback. We also want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website following the presentation. The first part 1 of the series will also be posted. There were some challenges on the website with getting part 1 posted prior to today, but both part 1 and part 2 will be posted hopefully in the next few days. Lastly, this webinar will be interactive. On your screen, you have a taskbar with buttons that say Q&A and chat. Please use the Q&A feature to ask our presenter questions throughout the presentation. I'll be monitoring those. I'll collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may also pose questions to you. Please use the chat feature to answer these questions. Now, let's begin our webinar. Dr. Anthony Zazzarino will be presenting today. He's a full-time faculty member at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. He currently provides instruction for professional education courses for New Jersey's supported housing agencies, implementing community support services. He also teaches in the master's program in rehabilitation counseling and the doctoral program in counselor education and supervision. Dr. Zazzarino is a licensed professional counselor, an approved clinical supervisor, and a certified psychiatric rehabilitation practitioner. He completed his PhD in counselor education and supervision at Walden University, where he focused on improving the lives of sexual minorities with serious mental illnesses and enhancing individuals' knowledge of multicultural competence. Dr. Zazzarino is actively presenting at local, state, and national conferences related to psychiatric rehabilitation methods, counseling services, and supervision practices. In addition to his work at Rutgers, Dr. Zazzarino is a suicide prevention trainer for the Society for the Prevention of Teen Suicide. He facilitates group therapy for adolescents and adults at an intensive outpatient program, provides counseling services at his private practice, and provides clinical supervision for counselors in need of supervised clinical hours in New Jersey. So with all of that, Anthony, Dr. Zazzarino, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you all for coming back again to part 2. I always find it uncomfortable when people read that bio because all I really want to say is all of that translates to extra student loans. So it's okay. We're all in this together, but thank you so much for that introduction. Like Ann mentioned, this webinar is going to be a little bit more interactive than the last one. I really hope that people have access to that chat feature. There's going to be some questions that I pose and some interactive discussion, I think, to enhance this part of the webinar. But most importantly, thank you all again for coming back to part 2. What I mentioned last week, 2 weeks ago actually, and what I'm going to continue to mention today is that this webinar really is only just the beginning of our education and our knowledge and our quest to continue to improve the behavioral health needs of a very multifaceted group of individuals. And I think this webinar today will specifically highlight all the different factors that influence the behavioral health needs of sexual minorities. So today, we're hoping to, at the end of this, identify additional factors that may contribute to the increased mental health needs. We're going to discuss some risk factors and warning signs of suicide, and describe the positive psychology framework and apply this framework to working with sexual minorities. As always, if at any point in time there are questions like Dr. Murphy mentioned, please raise them and I'll make sure to answer them at the end. So since this is part 2, I think it's just really important to do a quick review from part 1. Just to make sure if anybody wasn't here that we're starting from a standard place. But if you were here, just to kind of refresh your memory a little bit about some of those key points that we talked about 2 weeks ago. So one of the first things that we discussed was the idea of sexual orientation being more than just lesbian, gay, and bisexual. And for those of you who were a part of this 2 weeks ago, we had the little activity with the different sexual orientation flags where we got into describing and looking at different sexual orientations like omnisexual and sapiosexual and pansexual and asexual. And all of that information, if you weren't here 2 weeks ago, you can catch again on the PowerPoint that gets posted. And then just to reiterate, the reason that we're using the term sexual minority today and 2 weeks ago is to really give some differentiation between sexual identity and gender expression or gender identity. So in today's webinar, again, we will not be discussing anything to do with gender identity or transgender or gender diverse populations. If you're more interested in that, you can join our webinars in July, where we're going to delve into that population a little bit more specifically. The other piece, I think, from 2 weeks ago to stress is the idea of the minority stress model, which is a really comprehensive conceptual framework to explore the lives of really any individual that experiences minority stress. But it's really been applied to working with sexual minorities extensively. And today we're going to build on that and build on the idea of the stressors that many individuals that identify as a sexual minority, what they might experience and how that does impact their lives. And more importantly, how can you as a behavioral healthcare worker support their life from and support their quest to overcome those minority stressors. Part 1, we also talked about the increase in mental health needs. We talked about the correlation between somebody identifying as a sexual minority and having a mental health diagnosis. And unfortunately, we also talked about, though there's an increase in need, there's also a decrease in utilization. We talked about some of the challenges behind that, about a more inclusive environment, about learning the language and speaking the language. And one of the things that we talked about at the end of last session was, what could you all do to try to promote a more inclusive environment? So as I keep going, I'm going to ask you all if you could start typing in the chat box to just let us know, what is one thing that perhaps you did from 2 weeks ago to today to try to promote a more inclusive environment at your workplace? And while you're all chatting that, typing that in the chat box, I will continue. So we talked, I think, 2 weeks ago about the increase in mental health needs. We talked about the increase in mental health diagnoses such as anxiety, depression, PTSD. We talked a little bit about the ideas and the increase in diagnosis related to a serious mental health disorder like schizophrenia and major depression. And what we're going to drill down today are these multifaceted aspects that really influence and really impact those diagnoses, right? So we'll talk a little bit about the increase in victimization. We will talk some about substance use. We'll talk a little bit about the medical issues that correspond with the substance use. We'll get into relational issues and suicide. And as we continue to have these conversations, you're going to see that each factor really builds upon one another, and it really isn't a linear process, which really makes supporting and helping individuals that identify as a sexual minority quite difficult. So let's see, before we move on, I see Lauren, you work in a school-based therapist. I've gotten kiddos together and started a GSA, excellent. Talked about the training and what I learned to share knowledge. You know, that's so important, and I'm gonna share this little bit of information, and I'll explain where in this PowerPoint it comes up. One of my biggest challenges when putting this PowerPoint together was to not make assumptions, right? And I think sometimes being in the field and studying this over the past 3.5 years, I can make some assumptions that what I'm going to share, everybody knows. And so before doing this, I actually did a quick little survey of some of my friends, both in the mental health field and those who aren't, and said, hey, do you know this information? Tell me what you know about this other piece of information. And I was shocked to see that many people, even people that I graduated with in my PhD program, were not aware of some of the issues and some of the factors that we're going to talk about today. And so the fact that you take this information and you continue to spread the information and talk about it is one of the most important parts of improving the lives of sexual minorities, is just to educate other people so they know maybe how best to work with this population, and most importantly, just to have a basic set of knowledge and skills. Displaying quotes around my office. It's always actually, it's a really good, positive, uplifting activity that you can do that we'll talk a little bit more today in terms of the positive psychology framework. Okay, I see some pride flags getting thrown out there. And just to remind everyone, in case, you know, and this is what we talked about 2 weeks ago too, is, you know, one of the important pieces of all of this is, and this relates to the underutilization, is the fact that the APA diagnosed individuals who identified as a sexual minority as having a mental health disorder. And we talked about that 2 weeks ago, but also the fact that this Sunday is actually World Pride in New York City to celebrate the 50th year anniversary. So we talk about all of these issues, but recognizing it and grounding it in the environment and grounding it in the fact that this is still a really new and relevant topic to discuss. Robert, I think it all counts. So I'm not going to go through all of these wonderful comments, but I think it's just great to see that people are trying to take what we learned, take what we talked about 2 weeks ago, and just trying to do something. And keep in mind, one thing that you can do is better than nothing. So thank you all, and hopefully you'll take some more stuff from today. So let's get into the idea of victimization, right? Which is a contributing factor to the increase in mental health needs. So unfortunately, what we see is that victimization can start during adolescence, right? So especially in 2019, victimization is not only occurring in schools, but it's also occurring outside of schools through the use of social medias. Um, and that's a really big contributing factor right now with victimization, is the ongoing and the never-ending bullying through, Snapchat, through Instagram, through all of these social media platforms. Um, and sadly, once somebody uh, is victimized during adolescence, the research demonstrates their susceptibility to being re-victimized later on, so in their early adulthood and later on in life. The one thing I actually just came across, and I don't think we spend too much time talking about this, is the older population. So it's 65, 75 and plus, and their levels of victimization is also increasing. So we tend to focus solely on adolescents because it's probably the most prominent one that we hear about because of bullying, but the victimization runs the gamut. Another influence with the victimization is the idea of adolescents coming out and coming out at an earlier age. The coming out process is another one that we're not going to get into in depth today, but it is a very individualized process, and it's a process that has to be shaped and guided by the person themselves. What I've often heard sometimes is behavioral healthcare workers meeting with an adolescent or an older child, like we're talking maybe 11, 12, 13, and urging that individual to come out and be who they are. And I think the premise there is with good intent, but keep in mind, we don't know the factors and the parameters around that person's life. So if they come out, do they have a supportive network of friends and family? What does that mean for them culturally? Do they have the appropriate coping skills to work through any kind of bullying or victimization that comes along with that? On top of the fact that as more and more people come out at an earlier age, we also have to recognize that our brains are not fully developed. The frontal lobe part of our brain is not fully developed till about 24, 25. So we have individuals that are experiencing all of these different challenges and are unable to cognitively process what is going on, which leads them to have even more stressors because of that inability to process. Yes, Stephanie, I did say it's letting in. I use the term coming out because it's the most familiar, but I do think it's more empowering to use the term and the phrase letting in. And I actually just heard that on an interview this week. So the other piece about victimization is, sadly, it's very highly underreported. The research goes all the way up to about 85% of victimization remains undisclosed and underreported, which to me is just completely mind-blowing. That not only is it happening, and we know it's happening, but it's actually happening at larger increments and on larger volumes. And so I want you to think about, why do you think it's underreported? I was just watching something the other day about sexual assault, right? And how largely individuals who experience sexual assault don't discuss it because of many different issues. But here, when we're talking about the victimization of adolescents or adults or older adults, why do you think it's underreported? So I'm giving you a second to think about that before I give you the answer. But partly it's underreported because people don't want others to know. Shame, absolutely. So when we're talking about shame, shame comes on multiple levels, right? So one of the first levels when we discuss shame is there's still this internal stigma, right? We talked about last week, the shame of identifying as a sexual minority. So if I come out and I talk about being victimized, I also have to work through that process of letting other people know that I am engaged in a same-sex, sexual relationship, and that might not be ready. The person might not be ready to deal with that. Fear of nothing being done from the report is absolutely another reason. And in the next bullet point, we'll talk about what happens when individuals that are identified as a sexual minority are in environments where they're supposed to be protected and feel safe, like jails or prisons or in an inpatient mental health setting, and how the system itself does not support that. So people don't feel safe. People that identify as a sexual minority have had histories with victimization from police officers themselves. We talked about it just briefly. It's only been 50 years since the Stonewall riots, but that framework is still so prominent in the lives of many individuals that identify as a sexual minority. How do I trust people that historically have not trusted me or historically have discriminated against me? Cultural stigma, that's around help seeking. That's a big one. There's some cultures that we don't share, right, outside of our family unit. So I'm not going to go forward and talk about it. There's also some cultures that look negatively upon sexual minorities. So I absolutely can't talk about it because then I don't want my family to know about it. So there's a lot of different reasons, and I'm glad to see some of you typing through and giving some of that feedback. The other piece I think is really interesting and quite sad is that, and I made allude to this comment before, but sexual minorities have the highest rates of sexual victimization in jails and prisons and in inpatient mental health settings. So part of that then impacts their ability to reintegrate into the community, right? So if I'm in a jail or prison, I might be more resistant to participate in those rehabilitative services, whatever they may be. And then I also, and we talked about this last time, I might be more resistant and more cautious to attend more mental health services. So not only is the victimization impacting them, and we're seeing larger and larger rates of PTSD, we're seeing larger and larger rates of trauma within this population, but it's also then impacting their ability to seek help and maybe get the help that they're looking for when it comes time for that. And we know that re-victimization piece is really important, like somebody just talked about. So another behavioral health need that we might encounter is the increase in substance use. So historically, we've seen individuals that identify as a sexual minority in media have some experiences with substance use. And we'll talk about maybe the different types and what's going on now. But looking at it from a wider angle and a wider lens, we see that the substance use can cost about $151.4 billion annually due to a loss of productivity, physical issues, property damage. And so for you all, for all of us actually working with this population, recognizing that helping somebody along the lines of substance use isn't just helping them get back to their life, but it is also helping the greater society in trying to decrease some of this loss in productivity. Sadly, though, we also know that as this population has a greater increase in substance use, it does lend itself to more risk-taking sexual behaviors, and which then tends to lead to higher rates of HIV infection, which we'll talk about in a little bit in more depth. But what always is glaring to me is, and this is back in 2014, where they looked at the data and they looked at the idea that 73% of new HIV infections among 13 to 24-year-old males in the United States are ascribed to male-to-male sexual transmissions. So the gay male population is absolutely experiencing greater risks of HIV infection, and part of that could be due to the increase in substance use and the risk-taking behavior. Sadly, the more people use substances, there's a positive correlation with suicide. Part of that leads to the idea and the premise that the risk-taking behavior begins to decrease one's ability to think logically through their actions. And we'll talk about all of these different risk factors, and you'll see it all come together when we discuss suicide later on. What's also, I think, often failed to recognize and failed to have a conversation about is the use of substance use is a way to create a common bound, identity, and community. So we talked 2 weeks ago about the sense of isolation and the sense and the lack of support. Well, if I can participate in the activities where I'm seeing other people participate in, now I've created my own family. I've created a sense of community within this population, and a community that shares a common interest. Though the common interest in this case isn't the most positive one, it does help somebody feel like they're not alone. And I think often we talk about this with substance use. We continue to talk about the negative sides and the negative aspects of substance use. Unfortunately, we also have to discuss the positive aspects of it, right? So in motivational interviewing, we talk about weighing out the pros and cons and exploring what are the benefits of using substances. And for many people, one of the strongest benefits is I feel like I have somebody else to connect with. Even if it's the person that I go to only get high, at least I know that there's somebody there for me instead of being alone. The other piece with substance use I think is really interesting and really important as behavioral healthcare workers to know and to work with is looking at and exploring the 3 dimensions of sexual orientation. And we talked about this 2 weeks ago. So when we talk about sexual orientation, it's comprised of the sexual attraction, sexual behavior, and one's sexual identity. Well, what we see is that there's a stronger correlation between sexual attraction and experience with substance use more than sexual identity. So what am I really saying? I'm saying that someone who might be sexually attracted to a member of the same sexual sex, or somebody who actually participates in that, these 2 groups have a greater incidence in substance use than somebody who might actually identify as a sexual minority. So I want you to take a second or two and think about, what does that tell you, and what do you take from that? The fact that individuals that have a same sexual attraction, that actually participate in that attraction, have higher rates than somebody who fully identifies as a sexual minority. So from a behavioral healthcare standpoint, what that really means is it is our role and our job to create that safe environment, right? To explore and demystify some of the stigma around self-identifying and around just developing that sexual minority identity. So creating that safe space. And that also does mean, and I see somebody posting this, that there is such a shame, right? A shame associated with I'm a identified man and I'm attracted to another man, right? And I might act on it, but I don't want to identify as a gay man. And that shamefulness perpetuates the feelings of, let me self-soothe those feelings with substance use. Absolutely. So the other piece related to substance use that I touched on a little bit is related to HIV infections. And there's some things on this slide that, this is the slide I was talking about earlier about polling some of my friends to see how much people know about this. So we talked about the fact that 73% of new infections among 13 to 24-year-olds are related to male-to-male sexual transmission. But what I still find really interesting is, and this is why it's important for all of us as behavioral healthcare workers to know this, is because we might see people coming in to our setting and dealing with HIV or dealing with other STDs and having the knowledge to speak that language. So what we see is the difference between HIV and AIDS. And I think it's important to understand these differences because of the level of stress that people might put towards these diagnoses. So when we talk about HIV, we're talking about the HIV being a virus, and AIDS is the condition that the virus may cause. So when we're looking at HIV as behavioral healthcare workers, there's two important numbers I think that's important to know and important to understand. So one of them is the CD4 and the other is the viral load. And it's important to understand that because those are the numbers that really indicate to you the level of virus and how much it's attacking the person's physical health. So the CD4, another word for that might just be the T cells that people might be familiar with. But because HIV destroys the immunocells, the T cells, one way healthcare providers diagnose AIDS is to count those cells. So really the differentiation between HIV and AIDS is the number of T cells that somebody has in their body. So if you have HIV and your T cells drop below 200, that's when the diagnosis shifts to AIDS. The other important piece about understanding the viral load is because of this U equals U. Oh man, I forgot I put this picture here that says it. Just a quick yes or no in the chat. Before seeing this, U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable. Who here has ever heard of this phrase, U equals U? Oh, thank you for raising hands. So when we talk about U equals U, we're talking about the idea that somebody who has a viral load so low that it doesn't actually pick up in typical blood work, they're deemed undetectable. And undetectable means that they still have parts of the virus in them. It is just at such low levels that it can't be detectable by everyday common blood work. So what does it mean? So back in 2017, the CDC supported the science that someone who receives medication and has achieved and maintained an undetectable viral load cannot sexually transmit the virus to other people. So the idea that if somebody is deemed undetectable, they cannot transmit it to somebody else. And I think there's so much, I mean, right now, and this is why I think trainings like this is so important, there's so many new concepts and ideas that are going on about HIV. And for somebody who might identify as a sexual minority and they're coming in, the psychological, the emotional, the physical impact of receiving this diagnosis is still really prominent. And keeping ourselves engaged and informed is so important. The other thing that's on here is PrEP and PEP. So these are two medications I think that are important as behavioral healthcare workers to know when we are working with or having conversations with anybody who identifies as a sexual minority, or really anybody at all I think this can help with. So PrEP is taken every day before possible exposure. So PrEP is for people who do not have HIV and they have a sex partner with HIV. They can have sex with people whose HIV is unknown, or they share injection drug equipment. So PrEP can reduce the risk of getting HIV from sex by more than 90% and from injection drug more than 70%. So it is a pill that individuals have to take every single day around the same time as best. And they also have to get blood work every 3 months and blood work to demonstrate that they still are HIV negative in order to get a new prescription. But PrEP does decrease the chances of HIV transmission. On the other hand, we talk about PEP, and keep in mind that many individuals that identify as a sexual minority are victimized, and victimized from a sexual standpoint. So PEP is important because if taken, it's taken within 72 hours after possible exposure. PEP is for people who don't have HIV. PEP is for people who don't have HIV but may have been exposed during sex or sharing injection drug equipment or during sexual assault. So PEP can help prevent infection when taken correctly, but it's not always effective. So it's important if somebody's coming to you and they're discussing being sexually victimized that we have this knowledge about this PEP, because the best chance of working is if they start it as soon as possible. So with all of this, there is, though, some downsides. So what is being seen right now is, though PrEP is decreasing the chances and the likelihood to transmit HIV, what I think people are failing to recognize that it does not prevent other STDs from being transferred. And what we're seeing right now is a greater increase in other STDs. For example, I think syphilis is at an all-time high within the sexual minority community over the past 2 years, and it's been in, I think, 20 to 30 years. And part of that is just providing that education and being aware of this information so that we can provide the education. And I think all of this lends itself to more visits to emergency rooms when we're not feeling well, and we're just increasing that visit. So what types of substances are being used? One of the greatest, and I don't think this should come as a shock to anyone, but one of the greatest, fastest growing areas of substance use among adolescents and young adults that identify as a sexual minority is prescription drug misuse, but also methamphetamine, which can also be known as TINA or T. So what I'm going to ask of everyone now too is, has anybody heard, and I'm going to type it in here as PNP. Has anybody ever heard the term PNP? And I put it in the chat. And Tony wins, party and play. So what does that really mean? So what there's a greater increase of right now is this concept of party and play. Let's just do some drugs and increase in our sexual behaviors. And oftentimes that's leading to increasing in sexually risk-taking behaviors without the use of condoms. And that's what we're seeing. And this is when we talk about this multifaceted aspect, right? So we're talking about people that are increasing substances, maybe because they want to feel connected, and they're increasing that risk-taking behavior, which puts them at a greater risk for STDs or HIV. So it's really difficult to pinpoint one specific area to support an individual that identifies as a sexual minority, and more importantly, it's most important to look at them from a holistic standpoint because there's more than just these one or two issues. Another issue that we're finding is relationship issues. So we talked about 2 weeks ago the idea of isolation and the idea of being socially connected. Unfortunately, there is an increase in relationship challenges for sexual minorities. So for instance, we look at the idea of intimate romantic relationships and how they can have and how they can enhance and compromise health effects for individuals across all populations. But they've also been shown to be disproportionately challenging among socially disadvantaged individuals. So we talked a lot about the minority stress 2 weeks ago. And because of that minority stress they face, sexual minorities experience challenges to their relationships' quality and functioning. But what's really interesting, right, about this aspect is when we look at minority stress, a lot of the research has only been geared towards looking at the minority stress of one individual and not looking at minority stress from a dyad. So we know that the minority stress that one person experiences can impact their ability to successfully and in a healthy way commit to or have a self-sustaining relationship. But when we add the other person's level of minority stress, we're looking at it from a greater chance of having some sort of relationship challenge. The other thing that we know is that sexual minority individuals in romantic relationships may be ignored or rejected by parents, relatives, friends, and the larger society rather than validated, celebrated, and supported. You know, I know it is 2019, but it's not that long ago that sexual minority individuals were not able to legally get married. Part of that is still resonating within this population that legally I am less than this other group of people. So as a result, romantic partners may internalize these messages about their identities and romantic affiliations. And what we see is the internalization of stigma and stigmatizing messages about sexual minorities negatively influence the relationship quality and mental health among sexual minority individuals. So we see that lack of validation, the lack of nurturing, and the lack of celebration, where even recently I was just working with a 22-year-old lesbian woman a couple weeks ago in private practice, and she was talking about going to a wedding and was really uncomfortable. She didn't know if she could bring her significant other. And we spent some time just kind of navigating all of that. And in the end, her decision was not to, because she didn't want other family members to either look negatively down upon her or just have that added level of scrutiny at a wedding that she didn't want the attention to be on her. And, you know, sadly, that's situations like that are still occurring. And, you know, ultimately it is up to that person's choice, but recognizing and validating that that is an added stressor that could increase individuals' mental health symptoms. The other thing is we talk about the idea of social connection. So whether that's romantic relationships or just friendships, we know that the increase in minority stress can impact just everyday relationships as well. And one of the ways that researchers have looked at it was through the relational cultural theory, which looks at and provides a perspective to the minority stress model by looking at psychological distress within the context of relational and cultural disconnections. Right? So we assume that all people desire connection with others, and that psychological growth and development occurs through interpersonal relationships, right? So the ability to connect with other people creates a sense of belonging and a connection to something else. Although relational factors contribute to positive growth and well-being, relational and sociocultural disconnections can be harmful to health, especially when one individual in the relationship has more power over the other. So without the ability to form these healthy, positive relationships, we are increasing loneliness, we're increasing isolation, and we're increasing feelings of shame, which all can negatively impact one's mental health. And then we touch on suicide, and I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on this. I think there can be an entire webinar training on suicide prevention. And I actually think there was one, or there is one coming up. But looking at this concept that the risk factors for suicide are very multi-determinational, right? This is actually a picture that demonstrates this idea of this overlap theory, that it is not just one factor that contributes to somebody being suicidal. But if we look at this and we look at the population that we're talking about, right? So first of all, we know that in terms of demographics, we know that our sexual minorities and gender diverse populations are at a greater risk. And I'll give you some more statistics about that in a little bit. We also know that if they're at a greater risk, we know that a previous attempt is an additional risk factor. We know that sexual minorities have an increase in mental health problems, which is another risk factor. We know that impulsivity and substance use is another risk factor. We know that stressors are another risk factors, and we talked about the increase in stress due to the minority stress model. And we know an access to means is an additional risk factor. And we know in 2019, access to means can be anywhere. So part of that is recognizing that everything that we've talked about, right? The victimization, the substance use, the increase in mental health support, the increase in mental health needs, the increase in stress, it lends itself to the fact that unfortunately, our sexual minority youth are at a greater chance to attempt suicide. And the statistics are really all over the place. I've seen some research that says 2 to 3 times as likely. I've seen some research that talks about gay men being 6 times more likely than heterosexual men to attempt suicide. Lesbian women are 2 times more likely than their heterosexual females to attempt. But either way, we know that our sexual minority individuals are ultimately at a greater risk for suicidal behaviors and attempts. We touched on a little bit of this, the fact that psychiatric disorders, primarily depression and anxiety, substance use, discrimination and homophobia, violence, are all factors that can contribute to one's suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Self-identification at a young age and interpersonal conflict in regards to sexual identity and hidden sexual identity may affect those in the sexual minority community. We talked a little bit about coming out at an early age and self-esteem issues, societal issues, family issues, religion, and school factors are all risk factors. So if a teenager does not have support from his family, peers, and or society, he or she is at a greater risk. When we're talking about our earlier youth, so the teenagers may be more vulnerable to suicide ideation. Schools play a big role. And what we're seeing is that the ideas or the thoughts are out there and trying to get the support. So we talk about that social support. This is also another way where maybe social media isn't always the worst thing, right? We know that social media can be slightly detrimental because of the ongoing and the nonstop bullying, but social media could also be a more positive support and resource for individuals that don't feel connected, that they feel isolated, so that maybe instead of turning to drugs and alcohol or turning to risk-taking behaviors, they can turn to a network or a support system that helps them feel safer and helps them feel connected to something. And those protective factors. So as a behavioral healthcare worker, knowing all of these ideas, knowing the issue about the victimization, knowing the increase in substance use, knowing the medical factors, knowing that our sexual minority youth and adults are at a greater risk of suicide, it's important to demonstrate and to teach different protective factors like coping skills, support systems, support building, in order to combat some of those negative aspects of what they're dealing with. This is, I think, just a really easy acronym for everyone to remember when we talk about risk factors, and keep in mind that just because one has a risk factor does not mean that they are going to be suicidal. It just puts them at a greater risk and a greater vulnerability. What is more important to be mindful of with individuals that identify as a sexual minority are different warning signs. So we always say act on facts, right? Looking at and exploring feelings, actions, changes, threats, and situations. And one of the easiest things that we can do, I think, as behavioral health care workers is recognize that if somebody is thinking about suicide, there's also the other side of the coin where they're thinking about living. So our role is to, in a non-judgmental, supportive way, just sit back and say these three magic words of tell me more. So tell me more, tell me why you're thinking about suicide, or tell me more about why you don't feel like there's a connection. And really being able to weigh out all aspects of it instead of pushing down on just that one side of, no, you don't want to kill yourself. So as a behavioral health care worker, part of this is being comfortable having these conversations with peers so that we are more comfortable with having these conversations when they're needed. And they could be conversations that, let's be honest, are very difficult to have. Nobody wants to have these conversations, but they are really important, and they're most important with this population because of the increase in attempts and the increase in thoughts and behaviors. So one of the strategies, and one of the, I think, what's coming now is one of the best ways to really support individuals that identify as a sexual minority is the positive psychology framework. I'm not quite sure how many people have really learned about this throughout their education, but when we're looking at positive psychology, we're taking a different approach where we recognize that everybody has a set of strengths, right? And that it's those strengths that can help them overcome many of the barriers and obstacles. So a central tenet of positive psychology is to really recognize the importance of complementary, alternative perspectives on the human experience that depathologize individual experience, beliefs, and actions while helping them focus on their strengths. And we know that historically, individuals that identify as a sexual minority have been pathologized just for their own sexual orientation. Positive psychology can serve as a useful framework in clinical training and practice to both recognize and build strengths in sexual minorities. And it helps build strengths on different levels, right? So from the subjective level, we're looking at valuing subjective experiences. So talking about their well-being and contentment and satisfaction in the past, helping promote hope and optimism for the future, and the flow and happiness in the present. So let's really look at who you are and what your experiences are right now. From an individual level, we're focusing positive individual traits. So the capacity for love and vocation, courage, interpersonal skill, perseverance, forgiveness, originality, future-mindedness, spirituality, high talent, and wisdom. And so what we're seeing here, just to reiterate, interpersonal skills, spirituality, we're looking at the sense of connection, the sense of belonging. And from a group level, talking about different civic virtues and institutions that move individuals towards better citizenship, such as responsibility, altruism, civility, tolerance, and work ethic, helping people feel like they can give back and be part of something that's bigger. to help support that isolation and help support that connectedness. So when we're talking about positive psychology and working with individuals that identify as a sexual minority, it's just really quickly important to look at these 5 pillars of positive psychology and helping explore each part of a person's life in a more holistic way. So PERMA, which is the acronym, PERMA, makes up 5 important building blocks of well-being and happiness. So we know that positive emotions have an impact that goes far beyond bringing a smile to our faces. So feeling good helps us to perform better at work and in school. It boosts our physical health. It strengthens our relationships, and it inspires us to be creative, take chances, and look to the future with optimism and hope. So much of the work of positive psychology involves identifying and cultivating personal strengths, virtues, and talents. Right? If you could think about the work that you've done in the past or just within yourself, and you can think about your greatest strengths or some of your strengths, it helps motivate you to continue to move forward. We can also learn skills for cultivating joy and focus on the present, and looking at ways to build a more pleasant life, such as building positive emotions, the engaged life, so building that support with other people, also the relational life, helping somebody create a more meaningful life and an accomplished life. And by doing so, not only are we supporting more positive mental health, but we're also decreasing some of those physical health symptoms that are coming along with individuals that identify as a sexual minority. So there's 2 concrete, I think, interventions that positive psychology, and we're going to kind of practice one as much as we can in a webinar. But one of the first ones is a positive subjective experience. So activities and in-session experiences that support, nurture, and celebrate clients' identities. And if you can think back, we just discussed the fact that many sexual minority individuals do not get the chance to actually have a nurturing environment that celebrates them for who they are and for who they are unconditionally. So a positive subjective experience allows a behavioral healthcare worker to kind of flip the script a little bit and say, let's celebrate your uniqueness. Let's celebrate who you are for exactly who you are without judgment. And then the other piece to it is exploring different character strengths and recognizing that the people that we work with have a multitude of character strengths. And this slide that's up here, I think it's just a really a quick view of the different character strengths that positive psychology focus on, and how I've done this when working with people. You know, you can make it a little fun and print this out in a bigger paper and tape it on the wall and have somebody throw something sticky to the wall, and whatever it lands on, that's the topic for the day. So the 24 character strength is an attempt to present a measurable and humanistic ideal of virtue in an empirical and rigorously scientific manner. So in the same way that the DSM is used to assess and facilitate research on mental disorders, this character strength is intended to provide a theoretical framework to assist people in developing practical applications for positive psychology. So it looks at 6 different classes of virtue. So we're looking at transcendence, temperance, justice, humanity, courage, and wisdom. So the introduction of this suggests that these 6 virtues are considered good by the vast majority of cultures and throughout history, and that these traits lead to increased happiness when practiced. Each of the 24 character traits is defined behaviorally with psychometric evidence demonstrating that it can be reliably measured, and practical applications, including helping individuals and organizations correctly identifying their strengths and use them to increase and sustain their respective individuals of well-being. So we can use these character strengths in practice to support many of the individuals that identify as a sexual minority. So how do we do that? So this first one we're going to talk about is creativity, integrity, and vitality. It may be helped to reduce or eliminate the negative impacts of proximal stressors, such as internalized negativity and or cissexism, and fears about disclosure. Also, much of the literature on sexual minority identity development has directly linked expressions of integrity with long-term changes in one's overall level of positive affect. So acknowledging same gender, same sex attraction to a mental health provider may serve as a substantive expression of integrity that deserves recognition as an expression of strength. So just allowing that conversation to take place within your environment supports the idea of strength and integrity to who that person is. Individuals within the sexual minority community may have been stigmatized or stereotyped for expressions of enthusiasm, joy, and celebration of their identities that serve as important experiences for pride that should be validated and celebrated in the work that we do. The other aspect is regarding love, right? So love, we're talking about that social support and exploring how to first love oneself before I can love somebody else. So at the individual level, the experience of having a strong, consistent social support from others indicates that an individual possesses the character strength of love. Encouraging clients to recognize and explore how they value and deepen healthy relationships with support of others may serve to foster other opportunities to acknowledge growth experiences in the context of stresses and losses often associated with identity development. So we're helping individuals formulate what love really means and how to love others and build those social supports. With citizenship and fairness, we're creating a sense of devotion and duty to similar others. So we encourage efforts to belong to and connect with similar others. And part of that is because the research has found that high levels of affiliation with sexual minority have been linked to lower levels of internalized homonegativity. So if I can connect with people that are more like me, then I don't have to be afraid of who I am because there are other people that I can look at and visually see, okay, I'm not that different. Gratitude is the next to last one. So when we're talking about gratitude, we're looking at the idea that someone with whom the individual has had little or direct contact encourages gratitude visits. You can encourage gratitude journals or daily reflection. These exercises may be helpful to use with sexual minorities, particularly those who struggle to identify positive experiences due to internalized stigma. So just experiencing gratitude and working through maybe some of those negative experiences and focusing on the positive things that people do have in their life. And then the last piece is the spirituality piece. So supporting beliefs about higher purpose and a sense of connection to something else. And we talked a lot about that sense of isolation and loneliness. So, oh good, we have some time. What I want us to do as a group, as best as we can right now, is I want you to try to take a couple minutes and I want us to practice one positive psychology activity known as the best possible self. So the best possible self activity can be used to increase optimism. This is going to require you to envision yourself in an imaginary future in which everything has turned out in the most optimal way. By doing this, right, historically, we've seen that writing about and imagining a best possible self has repeatedly been demonstrated to increase people's mood and well-being. The goal of doing a best possible self activity is really to increase optimism in terms of expecting favorable outcomes. So, this can be done in written form or it could be done in drawing form, or it could just be done in talk form. But what I'm going to ask you to do, what if we were doing this in real life, I would have you kind of sit through and sit for 10 minutes. But what I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm going to set a timer for 1 minute. And I know through a webinar, this could be quite cringe-inducing to have silence for a minute, but we could all support a minute of silence. And I want you to imagine your life the way you've always imagined it would be. I want you to imagine your best possible self. Picture that you have performed to the best of your abilities and that you had achieved the things you wanted to in life. Don't think about anything else, but just visualize what your best possible self would look like for the next 50 seconds. Focus on the amazing things that you could accomplish, the amazing things that you would like to accomplish, the great people in your life that are surrounding you and supporting you, the environment that you would like to be in your best possible self. Think about all the things that you would like to accomplish and that you have accomplished. Okay, you heard the timer. That means that minute is up. So what you can do, like I said, with somebody, you can actually have them visualize that for about a minute or two and then write it out or draw it out for the next 7 or 8 minutes. And then you can kind of process it by asking them, how does this affect you emotionally? Or does it affect your current self-image? So for all of you, I want you to think about what your best possible self is. And how does that motivate you and where you are at right now? How does it motivate your day tomorrow? How does it motivate your day for the rest of the day today? Does it inspire you? Does it make you want to make changes? What have you done so far that's already leading you to be your best possible self? And when we're working with individuals that identify as a sexual minority, it gives people the opportunity to see hope and to see optimism for many people that might have had many struggles that we've talked about already, right? We talked about the victimization, we talked about substance use, we talked about suicidal thoughts, we talked about medical issues, we talked about anxiety, depression, trauma. So for somebody coming in, being able to have that hope for the future and being able to talk about what that is and articulate what that is, and then you being able to build on their strengths to help figure out a way that we can get there slowly, provides hope and optimism to a group of people that sometimes just don't have that. And Catherine, I love the point that you just made about gives a little bit more courage. At the core of what we do with anybody is the importance of a safe, trusting, therapeutic relationship. And building that relationship with individuals that identify as a sexual minority allows them to continue to feel safe and trusted and have a good environment that they can be courageous, they can make some difficult decisions, they can role play with you all different ways to engage and to have conversations that they might otherwise be too nervous to do. It also allows them to build and work on social interactions. Absolutely, Lydia. So what is it that they have right now, and who is it in their everyday life that can help them get to the point where they want to get to in their best possible self? And I think regardless of who we are, if we all can continue to think about our best possible self, and how do we get there, it becomes that hook, right? It becomes that motivating hook for us to continue to work through our day-to-day struggles and get to where we really want to get to. So I just came across this as a quick little guideline, and I think this kind of summarizes a little bit about what we were trying to do today and 2 weeks ago. So one of the first things is asking about clients' sexual orientation just as you would any other question about their lives or identity. Doing so in a very non-judgmental way, doing so that gives them the empowerment to have that conversation. Be comfortable with issues and terminology. So we just started having these conversations about PrEP and you equals you and different terminologies relating to sexual orientation. And I will say, I think part of this, because the language is constantly changing, we all need to continue to educate ourselves and continue to get more guidance and more education about the terminology. Because the more comfortable we are with the issues and with terminology, the more comfortable our clients will be coming to us and supporting that positive relationship. Making your office space more welcoming. We talked about that regarding just the little rainbow flag can go a long way. Making sure pamphlets or pictures demonstrate diversity. Using language that does not implicitly assume the client's sexual orientation. And I think that goes along with number 1. Number 5, be aware of assumptions. Part of doing good work with anybody is first being able to recognize our own implicit biases and our own assumptions to make sure that we can work through them so we're not imparting them with the people that we work with. Develop systems of record keeping that are respectful for sexual minority clients. And this is even more so important when we talk about gender diverse individuals in a couple next month. But also modeling respect for the client and their identity. I think being able to be a good role model for many of our people demonstrates that there are people out in the community that do not stigmatize, that do not oppress, that do not discriminate people for their own sexual identity. So you all, even before you open your mouths, have a really important role of just modeling respect and modeling appreciation. So before we get to the Q&A, and I will make sure you get this slide. I think I added this too late, so I'll make sure that Anne, when she posts this PowerPoint, that Dr. Murphy posts this resources and readings. I know this was asked for, but I just tried to pull together some important resources and readings I think that might be helpful. The Trevor Project is really, I think, provides a ton of different resources out there. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, GLAAD, they have a great resource list. Something I don't actually have up here, I'll add it though, is the American Association of Suicidology. They have a lot of excellent resources as well that are specifically geared towards our sexual and gender diverse individuals. There's some really good readings. So the Handbook of LGBT Affirmative Couple and Family Therapy, Modern Family Stories of Extraordinary Journeys to Kinship. PFLAG is another great resource, the National LGBT Health Education Family Acceptance Project. These resources are not only good for you and for your clients, but also to maybe recommend to other family members and other supports. So I will make sure you get that. And it is 1:15, so I saved some time for any questions or answers. But before we get to questions, I just want to thank everybody for participating in these 2 days. It's been really rewarding, I think, just putting this webinar together and getting some of this information out. And I think it's just so helpful that you all are here for this hour and a half and then an hour and a half 2 weeks ago to continue to increase your education and awareness, because every bit of every moment that you spend educating yourself is another moment that you can best support individuals that are experiencing a lot of different issues and vulnerability. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Zazarino. So we'll open it up now to questions from anybody, any of the participants. So you can feel free to post a question in the Q&A or in the chat box if you have any. I did receive a couple questions as we were going. So there was a question about additional resources related to PrEP and PEP and how to get access to those. So I did post in the chat a couple of links. There's a lot more out there, but those are some reliable resources where you can start to read a little bit more about that. There was also a question about the recording from the first webinar. So we are having a little bit of trouble with our website and getting the videos posted, but I will email out a link to part 1 of Dr. Zazarino's webinar. So you can see that or share it. And then similarly, after this webinar, we'll send out this recording, and ultimately they will be posted on our website and you can access them there. I had a question while the other attendees are thinking of some questions that I wondered if you could address, Anthony. So I was listening the other day to an interesting discussion on the radio, and it was a younger person who identified as queer talking to an older woman who I believe was in her later 60s who identified as lesbian. And they were sort of having a conversation about terminology and identity and their experiences, and they seemed pretty different. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, sort of the age and generational differences that you see, and how should folks as behavioral health providers approach that?
That's a really good question. And it really is interesting if you could look at language through generations. So the term queer at one point was a really derogatory term used to negatively represent individuals that identify as a sexual or even gender diverse population. Nowadays, that term queer has kind of taken a whole nother spin to it to be more of a more encompassing, overarching term to represent many different diversities, whether it's sexual orientation or gender diversity, and more of just an expression. So I think from a behavioral healthcare standpoint, one of the things is to continue to just educate yourselves and continue to read about what's being said, what's being out there, but also not assuming that just because somebody who's 15 or 16 likes to use the term queer, that every 15, 16, 25-year-old likes it. And I think it's important to have conversations about language when we're working with people. What do you find offensive? What are you okay with? Because we need to individually tailor our support to the person we're working with. And I think that absolutely includes the language as well. It's really interesting right now too, because I mean, this is such a great time, I think, because of the 50th year anniversary of the Stonewall riots and all that that's coming up about it in terms of, there's so many great documentaries on Netflix. There's a lot of great TV shows out right now about sexual orientation and gender diversity, and even regarding the culture of HIV and how does, and the differences in views, and how people in the early 80s, how they had to fight for to be heard and fight for treatment and fight for support, and how nowadays having the conversation with younger teens about what HIV is and what the support was and what the fight was all about and how maybe some younger individuals kind of take for granted because they have this pill that they can now take and they don't recognize it as strongly as it used to be. But what ramifications come with that pill? And I think from a behavioral health care worker, those are some conversations that are worth having. You know, weighing out the pros and cons of using the terms like queer or just the over-encompassing term gay, or what are the benefits or the cons of going on PrEP versus just using a condom. It's conversations I think that need to continue to have, but we can't have that conversation unless we're educating ourselves as well.
Excellent, thank you. So I have a few other questions here. So I have three so far. So the first one is, my younger brother has come out and stated that he's gay. He's 11 years old. So that gets at what you were talking about earlier, Anthony, about the younger age when people are sort of identifying and verbalizing this. The question is, what can I do as an older sibling to guide him in a healthy way of living as an LGBTQ individual?
Oh, 11. That's such a good question. Just like anybody else, part of it is just being a positive support, right? The fact that at 11, I think you said your younger brother can come out, has to demonstrate that he feels some level of support within that environment. One of the most important things is continue to keep a protective factor. I mean, positive support is a really strong protective factor. Part of it is just having conversations developmentally appropriate with that individual, right? So at 11, I probably would not be having the same conversation that I would have with somebody who's 16 or 17. So making sure that there's also different resources on the Trevor Project website on developmentally appropriate conversations to have. But honestly, it just comes down to being a good positive support and continuing to have that dialogue, just like you would have with anybody. You know, at 11, hold on, let me think. At 11, so he's probably in like going into 6th grade, maybe 7th, somewhere along that. People start to date around that age. So having conversations, just very normalizing conversations. Do you have a boyfriend? Are you interested in having a boyfriend? What does having a boyfriend mean to you? And just making it a very normalized conversation so that I think people don't feel like what they are or who they are is strange or different.
Okay, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Next question.
I wish we were doing this in person, Dr. Murphy, because I picture our microphones going back and forth with one another.
Okay, the next question. So this is related to the activity you talked about, the visualizing one's best self. Yeah. The question is, are there issues with disappointment that come up? So it says, for example, if I consider my best self, it's easy for me to reflect on the goals that I have that I know I will not be able to reach. Considering these can lead to thoughts of being a failure, being generally unable in the rest of my life, etc. How would I combat this negative orientation among my clients?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the strategies and one of the premises behind that activity is just having conversations and setting things into reality. I would love to be a basketball player. That would be my best possible self, playing basketball on the Boston Celtics. Unfortunately, I am only 5'7", and I do not have basketball skills. So that is not ever going to be my best possible self. But what is it about that experience and having those conversations to guide, having that best possible self visualization to guide, what is it about that, and how can we kind of ground that in more of a reality-based setting? The other thing is to demonstrate that, okay, if you want to get there, what are the steps? And it's just breaking it down into more realistic and honest conversation, which is, I think, what we need to have, instead of just dismissing it altogether. right? Is really working through that conversation. And there's other activities too that can go along with that. So then you could do gratitude journals to help somebody be more demonstrate more gratitude for everything else that they do have, if they feel like their best possible self is so unattainable and it might be a little bit more dismissive. Well, then let's combat that with, okay, well, what do we have? What can we have? And what can we be grateful for? And Tony, yes, the Celtics, always the Celtics. Sorry, keep going.
I saw that. I figured you wouldn't be able to resist. Okay, another question. I think this is a really interesting point. I have a friend who believes that sexual orientation should not make someone different. The philosophy being help people who identify as sexual minorities feel, I'm going to put in quotes, normal, rather than focusing on being proud to be different. My experiences of gay pride, etc. Do you think it's more important to focus on not being different because of sexual preference, or focus on pride related to minority status?
I think it's important to recognize that there are differences. You know, I think when we talk about this from a multicultural lens, and I hear students say this often, oh, well, I don't see color and I don't see race. I think that's minimalizing and that's diminishing the unique aspects that everybody brings to the table. I think it's in the way that we then reshape that conversation, right? It's not that you are different, it's that every human being is different. And let's validate and let's celebrate who you are as an individual and not who you are as a different person. I think that's a better way to couch that conversation.
Okay, I see we have 2 minutes. I think we can squeeze in the last question I see here, which is the language at times can become overwhelming as everyone identifies themselves. What suggestions do you have to be fluid without being overwhelmed?
Oh, whoever asked that question, thank you. It is overwhelming even to me. I'm even prepping this webinar. I needed to go back in and double check to make sure that I was up to date and that I was aware of the correct language. When I work with people, honestly, I just talk to them about, okay, this is what I know, how, like what words, and we'll talk about this a lot in July about gender and pronouns and all of that. What is it to you, and what do you like to be referred to, and what kind of language do you like? I also let the person guide the conversation, and I mirror their language. So part of that is making sure that we're not projecting heterosexist or sexual identity labeling terms, but we're listening to the language that the people are saying, and we're modeling and mimicking, I think, that. The other thing is also, I think periodically you have to try to look at different resources and websites to see what is going on, because it is changing, and it's changing so quickly and rapidly that you have to keep up to date with it.
Okay.
And for those of you who don't know, sorry, Dr. Murphy.
Go ahead.
I'm seeing the comment about the Pride and celebration. The World Pride that's happening in New York City on Sunday is being televised. It would be a great thing to just kind of watch and expose yourself to see what's going on out there.
Thank you. And with that, we are just about out of our time. I did want to let people know, I put it in the chat if you scroll up just a tiny bit, but Dr. Zazarino will be presenting another webinar for us. He's alluded to it a couple times. This one will be focused on gender diverse individuals and enhancing services for those individuals. Part 1 will be July 24th, again at noon, and then the second part will be July 31st, also at noon. There's a registration bit.ly link there, and also a link to our website so you can see other webinars and trainings that will be coming up. Thank you so much for attending. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much to Dr. Zazarino for this wonderful webinar. Enjoy and have a good day.